All right, U.S. history students, this is our last video for this year. We are going to finish up chapter 16, and we are going to do just a little bit into chapter 17. There will be just a couple of people from chapter 17 that you'll need to know, but I will give you that information in this lecture. But if you don't get it quite written down, you can always go back and rewatch it, or you can flip forward to chapter 17 and look there. We are going to start on page 540 in your book and in your notes at the Wilderness Campaign. When General Grant was beaten so soundly at the Battle of Shiloh, you'll remember, many people called for his dismissal. And Abraham Lincoln said of Ulysses S. Grant, "I can't spare this man. He fights." After Grant's success in capturing Vicksburg and after his success in Vicksburg, Lincoln was so impressed with what Grant had done that he transferred him from the Western Campaign to the East and gave him the command of the Union Army. So Ulysses S. Grant is now the commander of the Army of the Potomac. In early 1864, General Grant forced General Lee to fight a series of battles all in Virginia. And what this did was it stretched Lee almost to the breaking point. It stretched their soldiers and their supplies to the limit. So from May through June of 1864, these armies fought all over Virginia. Union troops launched what would be known as the Wilderness Campaign. The Wilderness Campaign. Now, I'm not going to put an S or an N on the Wilderness Campaign because this was a series of battles. Some the North lost, some the South lost. But overall, well, we'll talk about that when we get there. Okay. This was a series of battles that Grant launched because he was trying to capture the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia. The first battle took place in May of 1864, about 50 miles outside of Richmond. Grant ordered General Meade to a place called Spotsylvania, and there was 5 days of fighting. 5 days of fighting. Over the whole month of May and of June, Union soldiers were pushing the Confederate troops back, pushing them back, pushing them back, pushing them back. Grant, however, had his worst defeat at the Battle of Cold Harbor. I'm going to go ahead and write that down. This was a win for the Confederacy, a win for the South. The Battle of Cold Harbor. So this is in early June, 10 miles northeast of Richmond. It only lasted a few hours, but in those few hours, the Union Army suffered 7,000 casualties. Now remember, I know I've said this before, but remember, casualty is death, injury, or capture. Okay, so 7,000 casualties. This battle, because it was such a resounding defeat, kind of delayed him from getting to Richmond, delayed his plans to take the capital. What is interesting about this is that the Union forces, the Army of the North, had suffered twice as many casualties as the South had. Twice as many casualties. But Grant continued his strategy, even though he was losing all of these soldiers to injury or to death or to illness. He continued his strategy because he knew that he would be getting more soldiers. And General Lee would not. Do you remember at the very beginning of the chapter when we talked about the advantages that the North had? One of those advantages was a bigger population. Grant could afford to lose more soldiers because he had more people. Grant continued advancing through Virginia, and one of the things that he said to another officer was, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." After Cold Harbor, he moved south of Richmond. He was hoping to take a key railroad junction in Petersburg, Virginia, but Lee's army had formed a defense. Lee couldn't break through. He couldn't execute his attack. He was winning the war, but he still had not captured the Confederate capital, had not captured Richmond. Now, do you remember how sometimes when I talk about history, say we have to go kind of back in time and forward? This is around the same time that Lincoln is trying to get reelected. Lincoln needs a victory. So he's really discouraged by Grant's failure to take Richmond. Okay? He's going to get his victory, and he's going to get it thanks to General William Tecumseh Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman provided this victory. I want to read just a little bit about William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman's performance at Bull Run and in subsequent battles caused him to lose confidence in himself. He offered to resign, but Lincoln promoted him instead. His success at Shiloh, plus the influence of Ulysses S. Grant, restored his confidence. When Grant became commander of the Union armies, he gave Sherman command of 3 of those armies and ordered him to begin the campaign that would make him famous. In 1869, later, when Grant was president, he promoted Sherman to his old post as commanding general of the army, and Sherman held that position until 1884. William Tecumseh Sherman, I really hope one of you has chosen him for your history research project, because he is a fascinating, fascinating person. But let's talk about what he did. What was this campaign? What was this thing that made him famous? Okay. In the spring of 1864, Sherman marched south from Tennessee. He had 100,000 troops, and his goal was to take Atlanta, Georgia, and knock out a really important railroad link. So, from May through August of 1864, Sherman's army moved through the Appalachian Mountains toward Atlanta. He was able to avoid defenses set up by a Confederate general named Joseph Johnston. And in July, Sherman he's there, so close to Atlanta. Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, if you'll remember, gave the command of the Confederate forces in the region to a general named John Hood, who had attacked Sherman repeatedly, trying to save Atlanta. But the Union troops pushed through, and the Confederate troops retreated as General Sherman held Atlanta under siege. If any of you have ever seen the movie Gone with the Wind, this is where the burning of Atlanta takes place. Atlanta fell on September 2nd, 1864, and a lot of the city was destroyed by artillery and by fire. Sherman ordered everybody who was still there to leave. You live here, you got to get out. When people criticized Sherman, here's what he said. He wrote, "War is war and not popularity seeking." Well, he's not wrong. And we talked about extensively in my classes about war and how ugly it is. And Sherman understood that, and he knew that, and he knew what his objective was. And he was willing to do what it took to get there. Whatever you think about that, I think he was a pretty dedicated man, and he knew what he needed to do, and he did it. And whether it was ugly or not, he wasn't concerned about whether or not people liked him. He was concerned about whether or not he defeated Confederate forces. There were people in the North that were not happy with how long this war had been going on. You remember me saying at the beginning of the chapter how a lot of people in the North thought, oh, this will be easy peasy, right? No problem. We'll knock this out in a few months. So the fact that it had gone on for years made them very unhappy. But when Sherman captured Atlanta, it showed them that there was progress happening, and all of a sudden, there's support for the war. Sherman's capture of Atlanta helped convince Union voters to re-elect Abraham Lincoln, and not just by a little bit. Lincoln won in a landslide victory. Sherman didn't wait very long for his next campaign. His goal was Savannah, Georgia. Savannah, Georgia was a port city. The South did not have a lot of ports, even though there was a lot of coastline. But Savannah, Georgia was a port. It was an important one. And in November of 1864, Sherman left Atlanta with a force of 60,000 men. And what he said was that he would make Georgia howl. And I want to read you this other thing that Sherman said, because I think this is pretty telling of the kind of man he was. I'm going to read just a little bit here. Sherman decided to fight a different battle. He would abandon his supply lines and march southeast through Georgia, creating a wide path of destruction and living off the land as he went. He would make, and here is the quote, this is what General William Tecumseh Sherman said, "So sick of war that generations would pass away before they would again appeal to it." Sherman's plan was to destroy the South. This campaign from Atlanta to Savannah was known as Sherman's March to the Sea. Sherman's March to the Sea. And in this march, he practiced something that is known as total war. Total war does not just focus on military targets. Total war destroys civilian resources and economic resources. And Sherman basically burned everything in his path, and I'm really not exaggerating. Sherman's idea was that total war would ruin the South's economy, and if it ruins its economy, it ruins its ability to fight. His troops were ordered to destroy everything. Railways, bridges, crops, livestock. They burned plantations and freed the slaves that were there. They would kill animals, cows, cattle, pigs, sheep, whatever. They would slaughter them, eat what they wanted, and then leave the rest to rot in the fields. Total war. We look at this and we think that's terrible. It was. It was. It is. And his goal was to make it so terrible that the people in the South would be broken. Their will to fight would be broken. Sherman and his army reached Savannah on December 10th, 1864. The path of destruction that they left in their wake was 60 miles wide. Sherman's goal was to speed up the end of the war. He wanted to get this over with. In the end, it kind of worked, but it also kind of didn't. Because what it did was it left the South with a real, just serious resentment toward the people of the North. And this is still there. You know, our book says it would last for generations. Guys, it's still there. There are still people in the South who have not forgiven the North. And nobody's alive still from that time period. But there's a lot of anger there still in the South for what was done to the people of the South. In April of 1865, General Sherman closed in on an enclave of Confederate defenders in North Carolina. Grant, at the same time, so Sherman's in North Carolina, Grant at the same time finally breaks through the defenses at Petersburg, and on April 2nd, General Lee was forced to retreat from Richmond. April 1965, the second week, Grant surrounded Lee's army and demanded its surrender. General Lee was hoping that he would be able to join the soldiers that were fighting in North Carolina. Grant cut off his escape. Lee tried some last-minute things. Nothing worked. General James Longstreet talked about the condition of the Confederate troops, and he said, "Many weary soldiers were picked up, some with, many without arms," that's weapons, "and all asking for food." Lee recognized that this was the end. And he said, quote, "There is nothing left for me to do but go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." So on April 9th, 1865, they met at a home in the town of Appomattox Courthouse. It's kind of an odd name for a town, but there you go. Appomattox Courthouse. Lee surrendered to Grant, and the Civil War was ended. If you look at the painting on 543, it is a painting of that surrender. Grant promised General Lee, and this is one of those things that kind of will help you understand the character of Ulysses Grant. He promised Lee that Lee's troops would be fed, that they would be allowed to keep their horses, and that they would not be tried for treason. Lee signed the surrender documents, and the war was over. One of the things that Grant wrote about this later on, as he was writing his memoirs, is he said, "I felt sad and depressed at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought." General Lee returned to his troops. General Grant, again, showing the kind of man he was, would not allow the Union forces to cheer for their victory. He said, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." The Civil War it just really affected our country. You guys will remember at Christmas time when I read you the poem, "I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day," and we talk about the lines in that poem that are not in the song that we sing at Christmas, and one of the lines that Longfellow wrote was, "It was as if an earthquake rent," that means tore, "the hearthstones of a continent." It's like the foundation of our country was broken. And this long-lasting war still kind of affects us today. Here's a number that I always hate giving out, and it always gives me goosebumps, but you need to soak this in. In the Civil War, almost 620,000 Americans died. That's not total casualties. That's not injured, captured. That's died. Almost 620,000 Americans died in the Civil War during those 4 years of fighting. That's more than we've lost in pretty much all of our other wars combined. The defeat of the South ended slavery. One of the problems, though, was that most former slaves didn't have any jobs. The Southern economy was in ruins. I wish that we had time to talk about Reconstruction and talk about some of the mistakes that were made in Reconstruction. The Reconstruction of the South after the war. There was a lot of hostility even after the fighting stopped. The war was over. How are we going to unite again? And that's kind of always the question. That's even the question now. You know, as we're, I don't know if some of you are allowed to watch the news or if you've seen that there's things that are going on that are worrisome and that are frightening. out in the world, and how are we going to be united as a country, as a people, with there's so much hatred and animosity on all sides. And as a teacher in a Christian school, I can sit here and I can tell you that the only way we're going to be united is when we start doing things the way Jesus did them. And when we start treating people the way we want to be treated, no matter what their color, no matter where they're from, no matter what their education level is, or how much money they have or they don't have. Treating people the way we want to be treated, loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving our neighbor as ourselves is the only way to cure what's going on, what's wrong with the world. Now, there are a couple of things that I do want to go into the next chapter. 3 more terms, actually, 3 more names. So, on 557 in your book in chapter 17, Abraham Lincoln, of course you know, was from the North, and he was our 16th president. On April 14th, 1865, and remember, the surrender was April 9th, 1865. Okay? So this is not even a week after Lee's surrender. President Lincoln and his wife, Mary, attended a play at a theater in Washington, D.C., Ford's Theater. If we get to go to D.C. this coming year, I'm hoping we are. I'll have some more information about that, hopefully by the end of June. But we'll get to see Ford's Theater, and we'll get to see the place where Lincoln died. But they were there to see a play called Our American Cousin, and there was a man named John Wilkes Booth. He was a Southern man. He was an actor, a very good-looking man, and one that was known to the people in the theater because he was an actor. But he was a Southerner, and he was not a fan of Abraham Lincoln's policies. He sneaked into the president's theater box and shot him. Lincoln was rushed across the street to a boarding house, where he died very early the next morning, and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, was sworn into office. The last term I want you to know, the last person I want you to know is Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman is an American poet who wrote a poem. He was a great admirer of Lincoln, and he wrote a poem upon Lincoln's death called "O Captain, My Captain." And this is the poem that is one of your options for memorization for extra credit. And this poem is a metaphor, and in it the U.S. is a ship. It's likened to a big boat, a ship, and President Lincoln is the captain that Whitman is talking about. And here's how this poem goes. "O Captain, my captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every wrack. The prize we sought is won. The port is near. The bells I hear. The people all exulting. While follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But oh heart, 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 oh the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. O Captain, my captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flown. For you the bugle trills. For you bouquets and ribboned wreaths. For you the shores are crowding. For you they call the swaying mast, their eager faces turning. Here, Captain, dear father, this arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead." My captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm. He has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip the victor ship comes in with object won. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells. But I with mournful tread walk the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. Abraham Lincoln had, for good or for ill, steered the United States of America through one of its most frightening and challenging times. And he got her into harbor, and she was whole again. But there are still cracks in our foundation. because there are still people who believe in racism. There are still people who hold those beliefs, some of those same beliefs that slaveholders held, though they would never say it out loud. Some of them would, actually. I've known a few that have in my lifetime. And so, as we think about what Abraham Lincoln stood for, and again, I don't ever want any of you to make the mistake that he was a perfect man or even close to it, but he stood for unity and for one nation under God, as he said in the Gettysburg Address. And it's important for us to remember and to attempt to carry on his legacy. However imperfectly he started it, it's important for us to carry on that idea of unity and of brotherhood among all Americans, that we live here and that we are Americans together. And I hope that if you don't get anything else out of this year of U.S. history, that you come away understanding that our history as a country is not perfect, and there are a lot of things that we've done wrong and a lot of things we continue to do wrong, but we're trying, and it's important for us to continue trying and to continue to be, as Christians, a light in this nation, so that our nation can be a light to the world. Have a great summer, guys. I'll see you next year.